An 8-year-old girl's innocent question brought a packed town hall to a halt, prompting Donald Trump to share a profoundly personal story about faith, loss, and redemption. What followed left the entire room in tears. The Church Fellowship Hall in Shreveport, Louisiana, was alive with the sounds of folding chairs scraping across polished floors and quiet conversations. Typically used for Sunday potlucks and Bible study, the space carried a different weight that evening. Standing at the front was Donald Trump, his unmistakable presence dominating the modest room. His signature orange-hued complexion and familiar hand gestures were instantly recognizable, but tonight, his demeanor was unexpectedly restrained, perhaps a reflection of the evening's solemn tone. The audience was a mix of families, retirees, and local community members, all curious about what he had to share. Among them sat someone who stood out, not for her size but for her quiet intensity. 8-year-old Lily, dressed in her best Sunday dress, held an old leather-bound Bible tightly to her chest. It was a cherished heirloom from her late grandmother, its edges worn and the gold lettering faded. Before they left for the event, her mother had leaned over and whispered, "You can ask him, but only if you're brave enough and truly mean it." Lily had nodded, her heart racing. For weeks, she had rehearsed her question, scribbling it in her notebook at school and whispering it into the quiet darkness of her room at night. It wasn't a question of simple curiosity, it was one that had weighed heavily on her young soul. As the evening progressed, Trump spoke on familiar topics: policies, accomplishments, and his vision for America. The crowd clapped here and there, nodding along, but the atmosphere lacked the charged energy of his typical rallies. Meanwhile, Lily waited, her small hands gripping the edges of her Bible tighter with each passing moment. Finally, the floor opened for questions. A line formed quickly as adults eagerly stepped forward to ask about local concerns, national policies, and even compliment his iconic red tie. Lily hesitated, sinking further into her seat, but when her mother gave her a gentle nudge, she knew it was time. Her legs felt shaky as she stood, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. The line of questioners stretched long, but as she inched forward, the room began to take notice of the small girl clutching her oversized Bible. A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. When her turn came, Trump looked down at her, and his expression softened briefly. "And what's your question, young lady?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly kind. Lily swallowed hard, gripping her Bible so tightly that her knuckles turned white. With a voice that quivered yet remained steady, she asked the question that had been echoing in her heart for months. "Mr. Trump, what does God mean to you?" The room fell into an almost oppressive silence. All eyes shifted between the little girl and Trump, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone. For a man known for his quick-fire responses, he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her, then at the Bible in her hands. Something in his expression changed. Before he could reply, the air seemed to thicken with anticipation, drawing everyone to the edge of their seats. Trump's uncharacteristic silence felt almost deafening. The man who had built his career on swift comebacks and unwavering confidence appeared unmoored for a moment. His gaze lingered on Lily and the worn Bible she held, and though his lips parted, no words came out. Lily shifted slightly, her small frame appearing even more delicate under the collective focus of the room. Her question wasn't meant to provoke or challenge, but its sincerity carried a power no one had anticipated. Her question had been sincere, born out of an earnest desire to grasp something far greater than herself. That honesty seemed to echo louder than any political argument or campaign slogan could. The room remained utterly still. Even the faint creak of chairs or the occasional cough seemed to vanish as though the air itself was holding its breath. Finally, Trump raised a hand slightly, as if to steady himself, and leaned against the podium. "That's a big question," he began, his voice lower and more measured than usual. "And it's not one I've always had the answer to." The admission startled many. Trump, a man known for his unwavering confidence, was acknowledging uncertainty in front of a crowd. He turned his gaze back to Lily, his expression softening into something almost fatherly. "When I was about your age," he continued, "I had a lot of questions about God too. My parents would take me to church every Sunday." He paused, a flicker of reflection crossing his face. "I remember sitting in those pews, staring at the stained glass windows, wondering if God was even listening to me." He glanced briefly at the audience, as if to gauge their reaction, his hand resting on the edge of the podium. His fingers tapped lightly against the wood as he continued. "My father used to tell me something," he said, his tone introspective. "He'd say that faith is like a ladder. You climb it one step at a time, and sometimes you're scared you'll fall, but you keep going because there's something at the top worth reaching for." At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. I thought it was just something he said to keep me quiet. A soft chuckle rippled through the crowd, breaking the tension for a moment. but Lily didn't laugh. Her gaze remained steady, her young eyes fixed on him, as though she were waiting for the deeper answer she'd come seeking. Trump leaned forward slightly, his voice softening further. As I got older, life threw its share of challenges my way. I faced loss, failure, and moments when I didn't know if I could keep going. And in those moments, I didn't always feel like God was there. Sometimes, I was angry at him. Other times, I thought maybe he'd given up on me altogether. The room stayed riveted. This wasn't the polished rhetoric or carefully rehearsed lines they were accustomed to hearing from him. This was raw, unfiltered, and deeply personal. But I'll tell you this, Trump said, his voice strengthening slightly. Even in my worst moments, when I thought I was completely alone, I came to realize that faith isn't about always having the answers. It's about believing that, even when you can't see the full picture, there's a purpose. There's something greater at work. He glanced back at Lily. Her grip on the old Bible had loosened just a bit, and her wide, glistening eyes reflected the fluorescent lights above. And to me, he said slowly, God is that purpose. He's the reminder that even when we fall, even when we fail, we're not finished. He's the one urging us to keep climbing, even when the ladder feels like it's about to break. The weight of his words seemed to settle over the room like a blanket. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, as Lily's gaze remained locked on him, her eyes began to well with tears. At first, it was a single drop that slid quietly down her cheek as she clutched her grandmother's Bible close. But as Trump's words lingered, her small shoulders began to tremble. The crowd noticed. Whispers started to spread, but no one dared interrupt the moment. Lily's mother instinctively leaned over, placing a comforting hand on her daughter's back. It's okay, sweetheart, she whispered softly. But Lily shook her head, tears flowing freely now, not out of sadness, but something far deeper. Trump's words had touched a part of her heart she hadn't even realized she was guarding. Trump, noticing her reaction, stepped away from the podium slightly. His face was uncharacteristically subdued. What's your name? He asked gently. Lily, she stammered, her voice barely audible. That's a beautiful name, Trump said with a faint smile. You know, Lily, sometimes the simplest questions are the hardest to answer, and often, those questions remind us of what's truly important. Lily nodded, her tearful eyes never leaving his. My grandma used to say that too, she said softly. She said God is always listening, even when you can't hear him. Trump's expression flickered, a mixture of admiration and unspoken understanding. Taking a deep breath, he turned his focus back to the crowd. You know, he began, this little girl just asked a question that most adults are too afraid to confront. What does God mean to us? It's not an easy question because it forces us to look inward, to face our fears, our doubts, and our imperfections. The room remained still, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. In that moment, Lily seemed to transcend her small frame, becoming a symbol of something much greater. Her courage had transformed the atmosphere of the event, shifting it from a routine town hall into an intimate reflection on faith and humanity. Trump continued, his voice steady but softer than before. We live in a world where we're constantly searching for answers outside of ourselves. We convince ourselves that power, success, or money will fill the gaps, but they don't. The real answers are the ones that make us uncomfortable, the ones that force us to ask, what do I stand for? What do I believe in? And who am I when no one else is watching? He paused, letting his gaze return to Lily. Thank you for reminding me of that, Lily. You're wiser than most adults I know. The crowd broke into soft applause, but Lily seemed unfazed. Her tears had stopped, replaced by a quiet sense of pride. She wiped her cheeks with the sleeve of her dress, then looked up at her mother, who smiled back at her, her own eyes glistening with emotion. As the applause faded, Trump's tone shifted again, signaling that the conversation wasn't over and that something even deeper was about to unfold. The room grew quieter, the air itself seeming to hold its breath in anticipation. Trump shifted slightly at the podium, his eyes scanning the crowd before settling back on Lily. There was a heaviness in his expression, a weight that seemed to reach beyond politics or public life. When I was a young man, he began, his voice lower and more reflective, there was a time I thought I had everything figured out. I had ambition, plans, and the drive to succeed. But there was one moment in my life, just one, that made me realize how little control I truly had. He paused, letting the gravity of his words settle over the room. The crowd leaned in, their curiosity almost tangible. Trump, rarely one to share personal stories, seemed on the verge of opening a window into a private chapter of his life. My brother, Fred, he continued, was one of the kindest, most genuine people I've ever known. He had a light about him, a goodness I didn't fully understand at the time. But Fred struggled. He had his demons, and no matter how much my family and I tried to help him, it wasn't enough. Trump's voice faltered briefly, and he cleared his throat before continuing. When he passed away, I was angry. Angry at him, at myself, and at God. I couldn't make sense of it. How could someone so good, with so much potential, be taken so soon? Lily's eyes stayed fixed on him, her young face carrying an expression far too wise for her age. Around the room, others were similarly captivated, their faces reflecting empathy and quiet intrigue. For a long time after that, Trump said, I turned away from God. I thought, if he's real, why would he let this happen? Why take someone like Fred and leave me behind? He exhaled deeply, his hand tightening on the edge of the podium. But then, something shifted. I don't know if it was a dream or simply a memory, but one night, I saw Fred's face in my mind. He had this big goofy smile he always used to wear, Trump said, his voice softening as if lost in the memory. And I heard him say, don't be angry. You've got work to do. The room remained silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone like a tangible force. Even the faint hum of passing cars outside seemed to disappear, leaving only Trump's voice and the quiet rhythm of countless hearts in unison. It was then, Trump continued, his voice steadying, that I began to realize faith isn't about understanding everything. It's about trusting there's a reason, even when you can't see it. And maybe, just maybe, Fred's purpose was to teach me that. He turned back to Lily, his expression softening further. So, when you ask me what God means to me, I'd say this. He's the reason I keep going, even when it's hard. He's the reminder that we're here for more than just ourselves. And he's the one who gives us hope, even in the darkest moments. Lily's eyes shimmered once more, though this time her tears stayed in place. Instead, she seemed to grow taller, clutching her grandmother's Bible with both hands as if it were the most valuable thing in the world. But just as the room settled into the solemn weight of Trump's story, someone in the audience raised a hand, breaking the stillness and redirecting the focus. A man near the back of the hall rose slowly. His rugged face bore the lines of years of hard work, the kind of man you might pass on the street without a second thought, a mechanic, a father, someone who attended church when life allowed. Yet his voice was clear and resonant, cutting through the quiet like a bell. Mr. Trump, he began, his tone deliberate. I've spent years trying to figure out my faith. Hearing you speak about anger, doubt, and hope, it makes me wonder if maybe we're all just too scared to admit we're struggling. Do you think that's part of the problem? The question seemed to catch Trump off guard, but only for a moment. He leaned on the podium slightly, locking eyes with the man. You know, he said, his voice thoughtful. I think a lot of us are afraid to admit we're not as strong as we want others to think we are. Faith isn't easy. It's messy, complicated, and sometimes it feels like you're just shouting into the void. But that's also what makes it powerful. It's not about being perfect, it's about trying. Even when you don't have all the answers. The man nodded, his serious expression softening as he returned to his seat. A quiet murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, but it was Lily's small voice that broke through next. My grandma used to say, she began, her words clear despite her small frame, that faith is like planting seeds. You don't always see them grow right away, but you have to believe they will. Trump smiled, a genuine tender expression that seemed to transform his normally guarded demeanor. Your grandma sounds like a very wise woman, he said. And she's right. Faith is a seed. It doesn't always sprout in the way or the time you expect, but that doesn't mean it's not growing in ways you can't see. The room seemed to exhale, the conversation breathing new life into the evening. People exchanged glances, nodded, and whispered quietly to one another. What had begun as a formal town hall had become something far more intimate, a shared reflection on life's trials, doubts, and grace. Then, an older woman raised her hand, her silver hair swept back neatly. Her voice trembled as she spoke. I lost my husband last year, she said. I've been angry at God ever since. I feel like I've lost my faith completely. Do you think it's too late to find it again? Trump stepped closer to the edge of the stage, his voice calm yet steady. It's never too late, he said, his tone filled with quiet conviction. Faith isn't something you lose forever. Faith is something that waits for you, Trump continued, his voice gentle. And often, it's in the quietest moments, when you least expect it, that it returns to you. The woman nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. Around the room, others were visibly moved, some dabbing their faces with tissues, others sitting in reflective silence. Trump's words seemed to settle into the hearts of everyone present. By now, It was clear that this evening had moved far beyond a simple exchange of questions and answers. It had become a moment of connection. The atmosphere in the room felt charged, not with noise, but with a tangible energy born of shared vulnerability. Those who had arrived expecting a routine political event now found themselves part of something profoundly personal. Lily's innocent question had opened a door that no one had dared approach before, and now, no one wanted to turn back. Straightening, Trump scanned the room, his gaze steady. "You know," he said, "there's something I've learned over the years. Faith doesn't always appear in grand, dramatic moments. Often, it's found in the smallest acts, the time someone lends a hand, listens when you're hurting, or asks a question as brave as Lily's. Those moments remind us of what truly matters." The audience remained silent, hanging on every word. Trump's voice, typically commanding and firm, now carried a humility that resonated deeply. Gesturing toward Lily, he added, "This little girl reminded me tonight that faith isn't just something we talk about. It's something we live. And when we live it, it spreads." Lily smiled faintly, her cheeks still pink from emotion. Her mother pulled her close, whispering something that made her smile widen just a little more. Trump's tone grew firmer as he continued. "We're living in a time when the world seems determined to pull us apart, through politics, opinions, and differences. But faith, it has the power to bring us together. Faith isn't about everyone being the same. It's about understanding that we're all climbing the same ladder, one step at a time, even if our paths look different." A ripple of applause began, slow at first but quickly building into a standing ovation. People clapped not just for Trump, but for the moment itself, for Lily's courage in asking her question and for the truth that had emerged from the evening. As the applause faded, Trump leaned into the microphone one last time. "So tonight," he said, "I want you to ask yourselves, what does faith mean to you? Don't be afraid of your answer, even if it's uncertain, because faith isn't about knowing, it's about believing." He paused, letting the words sink in before adding, "And if you've found something tonight that touched you, hold on to it. Let it grow. Share it with the people who need it most." The room erupted in applause again, but this time, it was accompanied by hugs, handshakes, and even a few quiet tears. Strangers who had entered the hall with little more than polite nods now lingered, exchanging smiles and stories. A collective weight seemed to have been lifted, replaced by a quiet sense of hope. As the room began to empty, Trump stepped away from the podium and walked over to Lily. Kneeling slightly so they were eye to eye, he said, "Thank you, Lily. You've got more courage than most people twice your age. Don't ever lose that." Lily nodded, extending her small hand to shake his. "Thank you, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice steady now, "for answering." Trump stood, giving her a faint smile before turning to wave at the crowd. As he exited the room, the chatter continued, the people clearly changed by what had just unfolded. Lily looked up at her mother, her voice soft but filled with determination. "Grandma would have been proud, wouldn't she?" Her mother smiled, tears shimmering in her eyes. "She would have been more than proud, sweetheart. She would have been amazed." As the hall slowly emptied, the lingering message was clear. Sometimes the bravest questions lead to the most unexpected answers. And in those answers, we find pieces of ourselves we didn't know were missing. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on your own faith. Share it with someone who might need it today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and bring us closer together.